third, thank you, Lisa, I forgot. Thank you for coming to our third Common Agenda Education Rollout event. Like the last ones, this is an event that is meant to educate y'all on our Common Agenda Briefing book, our 2022 Common Agenda Briefing book. With the release of this briefing book, 150 plus environmental advocates have crafted over 40 issue papers that provide y'all with policy suggestions on environmental issues within the Commonwealth. We've worked diligently for months to craft this agenda, and we're excited to bring it to all of you. Once again, these events will be recorded, and we have already covered the wildlife and fisheries and Virginia landscapes events. And once again, this is the Healthy Chesapeake Bay and Rivers and Creeks. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Pat.
Afternoon, folks. Pat Calvert, I'm Senior Policy Campaigns Manager for VCN, and I appreciate you joining in today. We're joined by special guest speaker, Renee Hoyos, who is the Director of Virginia Department of Environmental Quality's new EJ office. We're very pleased to have her, as well as several authors of co-authors of papers, three of which are really dedicated towards clean, improved water quality, with an eye towards the Virginia meeting its goals for the Chesapeake Bay cleanup plan by 2025, which, check your calendar, will be during the next governor's administration. So very key years ahead. And then Ellie Bamer with Environment Virginia is going to speak with us about the continuing work and momentum that we have in reducing our single-use plastic use, litter, and marine debris. Made some huge progress in the past few years. And so with that, we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A button. You can, by all means, include questions there because there are so many folks we want to, we're just going to use that Q&A. I'll moderate at the end after all presenters have completed, and pose some of those questions for our speakers to respond to. Speakers, you don't need to respond in the Q&A. You can actually do it verbally, a little bit more interactive. And so with that, I'm going to pass it right over to Renee Hoyos, Director of DEQ's EJ office. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you all for inviting me today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Virginia Conservation Network's educational series on their common agenda. I was lucky to be able to participate in the regional forums in August, and I think you will enjoy this session and you'll learn a lot. Before I became the Director of Environmental Justice at DEQ, I was the Executive Director of the Tennessee Clean Water Network for 14 years. We were a policy shop advocating for Tennessee's beautiful rivers and streams through legislation, regulation, and sometimes litigation. We didn't have the robust advocacy community that you have here in Virginia. And so a lot of the work was just left to a few groups. I'm very impressed at what you've been able to put together with the Common Agenda. The topics today are really timely. As we see abrupt changes to our climate, they're taking their toll on water quality. Increased stormwater runoff that causes flooding, and today it's not necessarily from streams, but from the sky. This impacts our communities, particularly our environmental justice communities that are overburdened by flooding. And it also impacts agriculture. And I'm glad to see so much work here being done in our farming community to protect agricultural water. We need to eat, and farms need clean water to make our food. And so I think supporting our farmers and helping them keep water clean on their properties is really important. At TCWN, we did a lot of Clean Water Act litigation on sewage treatment plants. We brought into compliance a number of facilities, but by the time the dust cleared, what was left was small communities that didn't have the resources to protect their sewage systems. And basically for many of them, their sewage systems were open ponds, very similar to what you see at hog farms. And what they needed wasn't a lawsuit. They needed resources, they needed community development. And that was the kind of stuff we were working on before I left. It became clear to me that the solution wasn't a legal one, but it was an economic one. These small towns in our rural areas are going to need resources to improve treatment, and not more lawsuits or more regulations that require more money. They need our help. They need our creative thinking. So I like that in today's panel, you'll be talking also about single-use plastics. I'm currently taking a course on plastics from Judith Enk's Beyond Plastics. The life cycle effects of plastic industries have repercussions all throughout the life cycle of their development. They impact environmental justice communities at a higher rate. They're ubiquitous in the environment. They're destroying some of our natural habitats. The faster we can stop using them, the better. So I'm glad Virginia has taken the first step to ban them through state government. So we have a lot of really interesting topics today. You've got some great speakers. I suggest you sit back, relax, enjoy the presentation, and then find ways that you can get involved and make our lives better through policy and help the common agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renee. Well said. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it right over to Dr. Joe Wood with Chesapeake Bay Foundation, who's going to tell us about the fastest, I guess, and growing threat to water quality in Virginia, polluted stormwater runoff.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks, Renee. Yeah, my talk is really about a briefing paper that Anna Kilias with James River Association and I pulled together. It's been a long-standing paper in the common agenda for a while now, and it's really all about addressing developed lands. You know, developing areas have a major impact on water quality. One of the things that always stands out to me is when people start talking about impervious surfaces and the level of impervious surfaces that lead to degradation. And, you know, there's the statistic out there that by the time you get to 10% impervious surface, which doesn't sound like a lot, the waterway's gone. You know, even as, you know, up to 5% is like pretty severely degraded in some places. And so, you know, there's a lot of impervious surface around to deal with. And so really my presentation is all about, you know, what do we do about that? And so, you know, the first thing, the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund is a grant program that's been around since 2014. There's been about $100 million invested in it over the past 6 or 7 years, you know, hundreds of projects across Virginia. And this grant program goes to local governments. It's a 50% match program. It helps them install best management practices to control erosion issues, to help with localized flooding issues or prevent, you know, infrastructure that's potentially lost from erosion and heavy flows related to stormwater. It funds all kinds of practices, things from constructed wetlands to biodetention to stream restoration projects. And really, it's a critical piece of our bay restoration initiatives to reducing nutrients to the bay through developed lands. The second fund I want to mention is the VCAP program. It's a younger program. It's the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program. It's actually a lot like the SLAF program, the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund, but rather this is on an individual basis, not for local governments, but for individuals that want to apply to do something good for water quality. And the fund, you know, can fund things like rain garden plantings or native conservation landscaping or tree plantings on landscapes. And generally it's about a 75% cost share program that helps people do, you know, good things on their property. And, you know, one of the things that stood out to me over the course of COVID, like one of the most exciting things I do all the time is just like walk outside and look at what's in my backyard or around. And I really love this fund because it gives people something good they can do for water quality with the assistance of soil and water conservation districts And you know, it's just a great program, and hopefully it's in its infancy. So you know, we really want to see more money going to helping people do these things that are the right thing. So just to summarize before I kick it to our next speaker, you know, we really came to 3 recommendations for this paper. The first 2 are just put money in these funds. You know, we need money to help local governments do good work on stormwater front, and we need money invested in this program to help, you know, help homeowners and citizens put conservation practices on their property. And then the last piece is, you know, it's really a piece of defense. And I would just say every legislative session, our conservation community is on guard. You know, we have adopted stormwater protections that have not always been popular and have, you know, been under some criticism. And you know, despite some of the costs related to this and the challenges and the difficulties, these are really, really critical problems. And so one of the things we always have an ask of our legislators for is to, you know, keep the good programs that we have and play some defense there. So that's a summary of developed lands and stormwater issues for our first fund. And now I think I'll kick it to, I think Jamie is next to talk about wastewater.
We can do that. Go for it, Jamie.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So yeah, moving on to another important sector that is a source of a lot of nutrients towards our rivers and our bay, wastewater treatment. This is a paper that Joe Wood and I actually worked together on. And I think it's helpful to just recognize that this is an area where we've seen tremendous success over many decades. So really since the passing of the Clean Water Act, we have seen you know, tremendous improvement in the technologies used across the state to treat wastewater. And that essentially means removing the bacteria, the nitrogen, the phosphorus that can cause problems when it gets into our streams and our rivers. And that can be impacts to recreation, cause algal blooms. Ultimately, it limits our ability to really benefit from the designated uses, swimming, fishing, boating in our waterways. So we have something called the wastewater needs assessment in Virginia, and that sort of spells out what local governments that operate, you know, treatment works, what they need to really meet the latest set of regulations or the latest set of needed infrastructure upgrades for their wastewater plants and infrastructure. And we have had success in recent years from the General Assembly in making you know, strong commitments in terms of funding to upgrade Virginia's wastewater systems. And we've seen, you know, treatment plants like Richmond really doing very well, using advanced treatment methods to really reduce nitrogen and phosphorus in the pipe that's discharging, you know, the final waste load. But that's not true across the board. We still have plants that need to make upgrades. And in particular, those plants are making these upgrades to meet the Chesapeake Bay Cleanup Plan goals. You know, this is this very ambitious effort that we've been collectively working on for quite some time. And by 2025, we want to see plants across the state in the Chesapeake Bay watershed using advanced treatment technologies to maximize reductions of nitrogen and phosphorus. So the needs assessment, and this is the first policy recommendation in our briefing book paper, the needs assessment calls for an additional $150 million to meet this need in terms of wastewater upgrades. And one of the great things about this particular sector is these are permitted loads. So when we make these investments, we know what the result's going to be, and we can sort of guarantee in permits that we're going to see those nutrient reductions going to our rivers in the bay. So that's a really good thing. We have to continue to remind our elected officials, our local governments, how important this work is for everyone who uses our waterways. The second major piece that we talk about in our briefing book this year is combined sewer systems. And these are, for those that don't know, these are very old sewer systems. They were maybe all the rage 100 years ago. But they're outdated today by modern technology. And what a combined sewer system is essentially is one pipe that carries both our stormwater runoff as well as our sewer waste. So when you have a lot of rain, as we've had several rainstorms this summer, that can overwhelm the system and cause partially treated or raw sewage going into our waterways. We have 3 CSO, or combined sewer overflow localities in Virginia, and the largest is Richmond. We've seen investments from the General Assembly in recent years supporting work in Lynchburg, one of the CSO localities, as well as Alexandria. But we know that Richmond has really the greatest need to overcome this challenge, because sewage going into the river is a huge barrier for folks enjoying the waterway and getting the most out of that resource. We've seen some investments to get Richmond started to work on something called their interim plan, to issue funding to do a handful of projects to start to really make progress on the combined sewer system. But the city estimates that it's going to take $883 million to fully address this large problem. It's just a very expensive problem, but it is a very important problem and a very urgent one that we need to continue to keep front of mind when we're talking about these issues with, again, elected officials. So we want to make sure we're funding to make these wastewater treatment plant upgrades, but we also want to make sure we're continuing to fund improvements to the combined sewer systems in Virginia. In Richmond in particular, we know it's an important need because we have a large segment of the population that is living below the poverty line. It's not sort of a cost that taxpayers alone can really bear in Richmond. And so it's really important that we find resources to help the city meet this need. One last thing I'll mention that Joe also said is we have to make sure that we are kind of staying on track to meet these Chesapeake Bay cleanup goals. And every legislative session, there's opportunities to sort of throw us off track. We need to make sure that we're defending against any legislation that could potentially prevent us from meeting our 2025 goals in regards to wastewater, and make sure that the Commonwealth remains committed to not only funding this need, but to getting it done on time so that we can truly achieve the benefits of a healthy bay and healthy rivers that the plan calls for. So that's all I've got. I will turn it over to Pat, and you can choose who the next speaker is.
Great. Again, thank you all for putting questions down at the bottom in the Q&A section. We'll hold off on the end for presenters to respond to those. At the onset, Director Hoyos referred to working with our farmers to improve water quality. So on that, with that, I'll hand it over to Brent Hunsinger with Friends of the Rappahannock.
Great, thanks, Pat. Like I said, my name is Brent Hunsinger. I'm with Friends of the Rappahannock. I am filling in today for Anna Killius from the James River Association and the aforementioned Mr. Wood from Chesapeake Bay Foundation. They are the co-authors of this paper that is entitled Working with Farmers to Protect Our Rivers and Streams. That said, Friends of the Rappahannock and many, many groups obviously work in Virginia on the issues of providing our agricultural community with the funds and resources they need to implement the best management practices that are going to help us reach our cleanup goals for 2025. Great. Okay. So just for a little background, agriculture represents it's the largest industry in Virginia. As such, it also represents the largest source of nutrient and sediment pollution reaching our water bodies. That includes our rivers, our streams, and ultimately the Chesapeake Bay. And also, I guess we should also mention we're Chesapeake Bay focused sometimes, but that includes all of our water bodies draining to, the Ohio River eventually, and the Pamlico Sound as well. That said, to meet the Bay cleanup goals by 2025, we expect that 75% of the remaining nitrogen pollution reductions have to come from agriculture. Even though agriculture is the largest source of nutrient and sediment pollution, the piece of the pie, if you were to look at it, is actually shrinking from the agricultural sector, thanks in large part to the investment from the state and federal governments in trying to bring those pollution levels down. It turns out that stormwater is actually the growing piece of the pie, and perhaps will continue to grow in the future as well. So that said, the way that we seek to address agricultural pollution in Virginia is through the Virginia Agricultural Cost Share Program, is one way, I will say. VAX, is, as it's known, funds the implementation of a wide suite of agricultural practices that try and reduce these types of pollution. This is through, some of these practices can include stream fencing, alternative water sources to keep livestock out of streams, nutrient management plans to help farmers decide when and where to apply fertilizer, riparian grass and forest buffers, basically planting trees, and also conservation tillage and cover crops to keep soil on the farms. These are a few of the examples of some of the best management practices that we are seeking to use in hopes that we can meet our goals in the agricultural sector by 2025. That said, by and large, the VAX program is administered through the 47 different soil and water conservation districts that we have in Virginia. So they are vital. They are the key to getting these practices in the ground. They have the relationships as well as we seek to try and work through these issues over time. So a couple of the policy recommendations that have come through the paper in the briefing book for VCN. The first one was there's something called an agricultural needs assessment that is done yearly or biannually perhaps. And basically what that does is it takes to the General Assembly and informs the budget about what it is, how much we need to spend to try and reach our Bay WIP cleanup goals. It has been found that through that last ag needs assessment that approximately $100 million a year needs to be allocated to try and reach our cleanup goals. Funding has fluctuated throughout the years. Recently, never quite usually making it towards $100 million. We are hopeful this year that we might be able to reach that point for some reasons that I'll mention in a second. Also, the second policy recommendation that we have come up with is to provide sufficient and stable funding for the Soil and Water Conservation District to apply that technical assistance to work with our farmers in the state to get that done. Our districts can be given all the money in the world, but if they don't have the resources and the capacity to be out meeting with those farmers and to get that money out the door, then we are not able to meet our goals. The final one is to maintain, enforce, and improve agricultural water quality and conservation initiatives in the next 3 years as well. I have one last update. So in the 2020 session, there was a bill, House Bill 1422, was identical to Senate Bill 704, formed a one of the things it did is it formed a stakeholder advisory group to review the annual progress towards the implementation of agricultural commitments in the WIP, develop a process to assist in creating nutrient management plans, and develop a plan for stream exclusion fencing program. That group has been meeting for the last couple of years. They will be meeting one more time next month in October of 2021 to vote on the proposed changes in the manual, the BMP manual. So that is one little update. They will also be putting a report together, I believe, to be reported to the General Assembly by the time they start in January. And one other observation when I was speaking with Anna Kilius, and something that we are finding when speaking with our soil and water conservation districts is what was mentioned before. The limiting factor for VAX is not so much at this point, perhaps, how much money we can get, although we will never turn down money for the program. It's how much the soil and water conservation districts are able to actually get those resources and those funds out the door so that those best management practices can be put into effect by 2025. I will take any questions at the end. I really appreciate you all being present today. Thank you.
Thanks, Brent. So we're going to shift our focus just a little bit, but to something that I think is growing across the nation, around the world, really. But in Virginia, we've made some huge headway. Ellie's with Environment Virginia and is going to update us on policy goals for single-use plastics, litter, and marine debris.
Awesome. Thank you, Pat. Hi, everyone. I'm Ellie Beamer with Environment Virginia. Like Pat said, I helped co-author this paper. First, I want to definitely thank my co-authors, Katie Register with Clean Virginia Waterways and Jim Depp with Lynnhaven River Now. Definitely would not have been able to complete this without their help, as well as many other organizations that are now working on this really exciting issue. There's been a lot that's been done on single-use plastics in this year. 2021 has actually been a pretty good year for plastics in Virginia. It kicked off with the General Assembly banning intentional balloon releases, and Virginia becoming the 6th state to pass a ban on single-use foam cups and takeout containers. Right after that, the governor issued an executive order which banned all single-use plastics in state government agencies. This is the most aggressive executive order in the country, so it was a really big deal that he was able to do that. And then in just the last few weeks, we've been seeing localities across the Commonwealth pass single-use plastic bag fees. So this was given authority from the 2020 General Assembly from Delegate Betsy Carr. And so we're just now starting to see localities take action on that. So a lot has been done, but that by no means means that we're anywhere close to finishing what needs to be done in terms of dealing with single-use plastics and the pollution and harm that they cause our environment. Our society produces an insane amount of stuff, and most of this stuff is only meant to be used for a few seconds, and then we throw it away. It's then either landfilled, incinerated, or ends up in our environment for the most part. This comes with pollution from the beginning until the end of it. And so we really need to move away from this throwaway society into something that we build it into a more circular economy. Biggest issue with this right now is that, citizens or municipalities are the ones that have been responsible for managing this waste rather than the producers that are making these products. And so that's a lot about what we've started to shift the focus on with this paper, is start talking more about how our producers can be held accountable and actually be responsible for their products throughout the lifetime of them. So we have a series of policy recommendations for this paper this year. Some go back to things that we've covered in the past, and then a couple others go towards this idea of shifting from just banning certain objects that are the most harmful to actually holding producers more responsible for their products and building robust systems in which we actually can recycle our goods. So the first policy recommendation that we have is to keep an eye on this bag bill. So eventually we need to pass a statewide plastic bag ban. We need to move towards reusable bags, and we need to do that probably soon. And so we're excited to see that these fees are being passed across the state. I think that's going to shift the public's opinion on this. I think it'll make grocers and lawmakers realize that it's kind of a pain to have different fees in different localities, and it's much easier to do something statewide as well. So we hope to revisit this once we continue to see more localities actually pass this fee. The second thing is to revisit the litter tax. And so the litter tax is a tax that's paid by businesses each year, and it goes towards cleaning up litter. These funds are not accessible by a lot of the organizations that actually do a lot of the big river cleanups in our state. So nonprofits can't actually use these. So it's all just local governments that end up using the funds from the litter tax. So we want to expand the usage of this, but we also want to raise that tax. It is woefully below what other states have. So we'd like to bring this up to a higher standard of what other states around the country have. States with far less populations raise a whole lot more from their litter tax and are able to do a lot more. So we know that by building this up and expanding it, we can take care of the litter that does end up in our environment. And then the last two policy recommendations are focused on keeping that from getting in the environment to begin with, because that's our ultimate goal, is we want to build this circular economy and not be having litter in our environment to begin with. So the first is the idea of producer or extended producer responsibility. It's called product stewardship. A lot of times there's a few different phrases being used across the country for this, but I think the most common one you'll see is extended producer responsibility, or EPR for short. EPR is not a new concept, but it is kind of new for the plastics world. So many states have policies around how you throw away electronics, how you throw away paint, different things like that. And the producers are held responsible for the damage that these products might have on their environment. We should be doing the exact same thing with plastics. Plastics are one of the most harmful types of products because they take forever to break down, if they even do at all. And there's so much of them too. You know, there's just so much. I'm like looking around my desk right now, actually looking at the plastic that I even see here. And so they're really difficult to manage. So producer responsibility essentially makes producers pay into a stewardship organization, which then manages the different types of waste that those products produce and the most responsible way to manage that waste afterwards. So whether that be recycling, whatever it may be, they have to pay for it instead of us as consumers after the fact, and ultimately our localities. It also incentivizes more recyclable products. So that's the goal, is to, you know, make sure that people who are putting out good products are paying less into the stewardship organization. Maine just passed a really great EPR bill, so it's definitely worth checking out, because I think that's kind of a model that we would like to see here in Virginia. And then the last policy recommendation is good old-fashioned bottle bill. A bottle bill has not been passed in the US for 20 years, but they are actually pretty common in states in the Northeast and then some in the Midwest as well. I don't have the full list off the top of my head how many states have them, but they do exist around the country. So it's not a brand new idea by any means, but essentially this means you pay a deposit when you get something like, I'm trying to think, like a bottle, I'm thinking a bottle of wine, you would pay the deposit with it. And then when you go to recycle it, at the end, you get that deposit back, and then the distributor makes sure that that is recycled. It's one of the most effective recycling programs in the country. You can see the rates at which bottle bill states have so much less of those items that end up in their environment. So it's a proven way to build a robust recycling system here in Virginia, one that we've seen a lot of people around the Commonwealth actually lose access to recycling. This is a way that we know we could get it back based on decades and decades of information from the states that do have bottle bills. So those are the 4 recommendations for single-use plastics. We want to continue eliminating the most harmful single-use plastics, start holding producers responsible, build a robust recycling system, and save the planet. I didn't have a 4th. I don't know why I didn't say him before, but thank you. And I'll pass back to Pat.
Thanks, Ellie. Appreciate it. That is an ambitious list of policy goals, but I think we're moving in the right way. So let's keep going. So with that, I appreciate all of our presenters presenting. And if you have any questions for them, please click down below on the Q&A button. And I'll be happy to ask those of folks here. So first question I have is, can we get a copy of the CBF presentation? And Kyle, do you want to respond to that one?
Yeah, hi, everybody. We will be collecting, I'll be collecting the PowerPoints for this one and for the other ones, and I will be sending them out. But if you really do have a faster question, send me an email, but I will be sending those out, and the recordings will be, I'll be sending those out.
And I'll add on to that, that this is being recorded, so it will be available for you to see later. this whole session. So if you want to, if you didn't get notes and you want to take those notes, or if you want to share it, by all means, that will be shared very soon. Second question is, at the state level, how can we, or can we, tie, force, or require expected new federal infrastructure or, quote, build back better projects to maximize pervious over impervious surfaces for either or both new construction and or repair, refurbish existing construction? I'm guessing that this is a stormwater question since it relates to pervious surfaces. Joe, you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of things at stake. I mean, I think certainly the SLAF program is the money piece to how do we, how do we invest in kind of redoing places that have already been done. Certainly there's a lot of considerations about new rain, right? Increasing rates of precipitation, and at some level, whether it's through the legislature or through agency direction or both, we need to start planning for more intense rainfall. We know our new development doesn't have no impact, as theoretically once was calculated, but I don't have a simple answer there, but I guess my response is sort of like, yes, that's something that we need to work on and that we need to kind of build some relationships to tackle.
Thanks, Joe. And whenever I hear an acronym, I always try to throw it out there. SLAF is in our jargon is the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund. Anyone else want to add on top of that? Great. Another attendee said, I thought Richmond has been making progress with their combined sewer system over a period of time. And isn't that why they have giant holding tank in Shockoe Bottom and the tunnel in the west end? Or are you saying that the city is only starting to address this now? Since this is a wastewater issue, Jamie, you want to field that one?
Yeah, of course. It's a great question. And I'll preface with, the 3 minutes that we talked about combined sewer overflows is just not enough to do the issue justice. This is not a new thing. We've known about it for many years, and Richmond in particular does have a lot of storage that has been put in place, including the retention basin mentioned by the question, mentioned in the question. It's not something that the city's only now beginning to do. It's that there's been sort of a renewed interest, I think, in really once and for all kind of tackling this. We've seen other localities, I mentioned Alexandria and Lynchburg, take on some additional projects. Richmond has been as well, neck and neck, doing a lot of things. And I highly encourage you to check out the RVA H2O website. There's also a dedicated combined sewer overflow website. The city posts data on release events and just helpful information. You can sign up for notifications so you can be alerted when there's been an overflow event. But I mentioned the city upgraded their wastewater treatment plant. That was to better treat their waste, but it was also to be able to treat a lot more waste and to, again, reduce the frequency that overflow events occurred. So they can treat more water. That means less water is forced untreated into the river when we have those intense rain events. So so by no means did I want to leave you with the impression that the city is really really lagging far behind. The important point, I think, is that Richmond has the largest system, and they also don't have there's serious concerns about whether citizens in Richmond can afford to pay utility rates that are truly needed to fully pay for these upgrades. I mentioned over $800 million is what the city thinks it's going to take to go this final leg of the upgrades. And I've kind of, the city's maybe, close to 90+% of capture. They're trying to get to 99%, and that's what's going to cost that additional $800 million. So that my point I wanted to leave you all with today is that is a really important need that we need to keep in mind to help the city out. But also that it is just really important for people who live in Richmond, who visit the James River Park system. We want to have a river that's not subject to these overflows in the future.
Great. Anybody else want to add anything? All right, pretty well covered, I believe. Vicky Metcalf posed a question. Ellie, for you, how would a bottle bill work? So would grocery stores have to handle it? Since bottles are currently taken to recycling centers, where do people get their refunds? Just generally, how does this thing happen?
Yeah, definitely. So every state does do it a little bit different, but I think the main components are typically about the same. So grocery stores would partner with the collection and manage recycling organizations, and typically what they'll have is redemption centers in grocery stores. Not all the time. It is based on a partnership. If the grocery store wants to do that, you essentially go and you drop it in this redemption thing. They look like those Coinstar things at the grocery store almost, and they're like lined up by the carts or maybe outside. You can go and you get your deposit back right on that. It weighs out what you're returning and can tell that way. You can also bring them to collection facilities that will then give you a refund there as well. So that's typically how they work. The main point of it is to have things separated. So if you don't, essentially, if you think about it, if you decide to leave your stuff that's covered in a bottle bill in your single stream recycling, that costs a lot more resources for them to actually be able to get that stuff separated and recycled. And so that money then goes towards the recycling of that. That's why you don't get your deposit back if you don't take it into the specific location, because you have glass, aluminum. Some states are starting to put things like water bottles and sports drink bottles in there as well. So the more separated it can be, the better it is. And so by incentivizing people to do that, it makes a big difference.
Awesome. Been watching since I was a little kid with all and out of jealousy, Michigan and all these kids showing up with bottles and lining their pockets. I was like, all right, why can't I do this here? So Jen Clark has a question for Brent. Will you share if you have any thoughts on what cities that do not have a soil and water conservation agency or district can do with so much valuable funding for homeowner, property owner projects can be accessed and provided that way? To that note, I'm not certain how many localities do not have a soil and water district. I believe Arlington City, maybe, but
sure. And I did have in relation to that question. I was not sure if she was speaking in the vein of agricultural best management practices or stormwater, urban stormwater as soil and water conservation districts. Joe talked about the VCAP program, which is available for, existing development. So that said, on the agricultural side, without a soil and water conservation district, there are other perhaps offices in those areas. There are other sources of funding. The only thing I can think of is USDA, the National Resource Conservation Service, offers funding on the through the federal level as well. And then as far as if you live in a city that does not offer the VCAP program, because not every soil and water conservation district actually participates in the VCAP program. Some cities actually have stormwater programs available to residents of the cities to spend money on projects that help with stormwater issues that they're having on their properties. I can think of Charlottesville, I believe, has CCAP. I'm not sure where they get that funding from, but I know that Arlington and many areas in Northern Virginia and perhaps other localities like perhaps Richmond and the Hampton Roads area have rainscape programs or have grant funding programs through the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay essentially as well. So there are other options out there, some of them coming from other nonprofits and NGOs as well, or your local government is another possibility.
So just to add a comment on the soil and water districts and where there's a lack, I don't have the list of communities. There's a couple urban communities, I think, that like have no ag presence, and so historically hadn't joined them. one of the Bay WIP goals, and I'm not sure of the status of this, but we can follow up, is to sign some memorandums of agreement between those areas to make sure those gaps don't exist. So I'm not sure the status of that, but I know it's something that the state was working on for a while there. And hopefully that'll happen soon.
And I'll just mention one last thing. I've heard, and I don't know the current status, but in years past, I remember there being interest in Henricus Soil and Water Conservation District to do more urban stormwater practices, potentially in places like Richmond. But that's really on the district to kind of decide what's in their capacity and abilities. But they are a neighboring conservation district that doesn't technically include Richmond, but can be a good partner. And James River Association has worked with them on a number of projects.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Lighty has a question. Tell me about why the litter tax is restricted, and is this legislated? Ellie, I know you're not an attorney, but do you have any insight on why the litter tax is restricted?
I am not 100% sure. I will be honest. I haven't worked on the litter tax as much as I know a lot of other people have. But I do know that, I don't know the reason why, but nonprofits cannot, use it in the way that municipalities can, despite operating most of the behavioral and cleanup efforts. So.
Yeah, Bill, to answer your question, also, I believe that it is legislated and that it can go to the locality or the government, but it cannot go to a lot of the NGOs that are literally doing the work. And I believe that it is legislated. Follow up with me afterwards, and I'm happy to give you that language. Our partners at Clean Fairfax, for example, have been very involved in that, and we're able to raise the litter tax rate, which is really still low, a couple of years ago with the General Assembly, but it's still limited as to where it goes. So there's a lot of pass-throughs, there's a lot of red tape, and basically it can be done more efficiently and probably effectively using taxpayers' money better. So I have one more question here, and this is a big one. We've got 3 watershed groups that are all in the Bay watershed, but this is from our partners at Lynnhaven River Now, and it says, I love the Chesapeake Bay, but I'm interested in how much attention is being paid to the Albemarle and Pamlico Sound watershed. As it was mentioned, the increasing frequency of intense rainfall events is a real problem for us in Virginia, and the Albemarle Pamlico watershed drains 25% of the Commonwealth. So there's not really a question there that I can discern, but anybody want to respond to that?
So I'll take a stab at that. For at least 3 of the funds that we've talked about today, Stormwater Local Assistance Fund, Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, and the Virginia Agricultural Cost Share Program. All of those programs are statewide programs, and the SLAF fund, you can get that money outside the Bay watershed. Local governments can do it. They have to invest in the match. They can certainly do that. The VCAP program, homeowners around there can do that work. The Agricultural Cost Share Program, the biggest and probably the biggest deal for water quality, it's the biggest chunk of money. That program, the money is divided based upon a model of nutrients that exist across the state. And so the Southwestern Virginia, the Pamlico Sound, all, money goes in those pots as well. They have a dedicated appropriation where they're getting funding. So, this is one of those situations where the whole state benefits, all downstream waters benefit from these programs. The wastewater money is a little bit different. It's not situated exactly the same. Some of the pots of money, certainly money can go outside of the Bay watershed and does, but there are several regulatory programs that are directed towards Chesapeake Bay endpoints. And really on the stormwater side, as well. That's another issue, is that within the Bay watershed, because we have a TMDL, there are specifically regulatory targets that communities have to hit. There's, potentially places like that outside of the watershed as well. But so the money can just be distributed. The regulatory requirements as of right now in many situations are Chesapeake Bay specific. So Jamie or Brent, I hope I got that right, but yeah.
Any other responses? Jamie's good. Brent, you're good. Okay.
I mean, I guess I would just say that it is unfortunate that, most of the talk and everything you see is publicity is for the Chesapeake Bay cleanup, but that's because of, frankly, the EPA has mandated such, and that it is, a national model for how we go about trying to figure out cleaning up water bodies in the United States. So, right or wrong, it gets the majority of attention. That's not to say, obviously, that the sounds don't deserve a lot of attention and resources as well.
Understood. Yeah. Why is there so much focus on the Bay? Get this question a lot. We've got this time clock ticking for the Chesapeake Bay Cleanup Plan 2025. It's a pretty strong driver for that whole effort. Not to say that all waters of the Commonwealth are not just as important, but it certainly is the way it has been, and we are working, and I know many of our partners like Lynn Haven River now are working hard with partners and Representative Luria at the federal level to try to get a interstate between North Carolina and Virginia effort initiative similar to the Bay cleanup. But cleaning up the Bay has taken decades. I've made most of my career up just trying to clean up the Bay, and that's far more than 2 states. So I think it does probably get an awful lot of attention, but I think basically the Bay is an awful big, important body of water to Virginia and to the nation.
So I just want to tag up on that though, because I get that like the Bay is always in the spotlight because it's this big thing, but the Bay being in the spotlight is not necessarily a bad thing for the Pamlico or Southwestern Virginia. And in fact, I actually think it's a really, really good thing because, EPA's mandate for the Chesapeake Bay TMDL meant that Virginia had to wrestle with this issue. And so Virginia went out and built an agricultural cost share program. And they said, wait, hold on, we're not going to invest just in the Bay watershed, but like, I would just say like partnerships there are valuable. And it's one of those things where, competition can be a good thing. I mean, there's always limited dollars to go around, but I honestly believe that. I'm not just saying that because I'm Chesapeake Bay guy, but I really do think that, you get people's attention about these issues and it's easier to grow them than it is to start from scratch. So.
Agreed. And I think that was largely what I was saying is maybe the Albemarle Pamlico needs its own TMDL. Anyway, so with that, I appreciate all the questions we've received, and it looks like I think we're pretty done with them. So with that, I'm going to hand it, say thank you to our presenters and hand it right back to Kyle.
Thank you, everybody. Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen real quick. As we finish up, I again want to thank our presenters and thank our guest speaker for doing such a great job today and being so informative. And I want to thank you participants for coming out and giving us your lunchtime to learn about the common agenda and become more informed advocates. As a reminder, next week we'll have 2 education series events, transportation on the 6th and resilient communities on the 7th. So we'll be having 2 next week, back-to-back days. So be very excited for that. But once again, I want to thank everybody for coming out, including our authors and our guest speakers and our participants, and have a great rest of your day. And hopefully see you next week. Bye, everybody.